we filled up 9 passports. We thought we would spend about £100,000. We spent about 1 million. We thought we would get on 120 flights. We got on 455 flights. We had 60 odd bribes to pay. We spent tens of thousands of pounds in cancellations of flights, of transport changes. I was bitten by dogs. I was mugged at gunpoint and at knife point. I had a heart attack. I had 22 bouts of food poisoning. All of these things physically are tough, naturally. But actually, then logistically, what you have to go through to get from country to country, running 3 marathons in 3 different countries each week, every week for nearly 100 weeks, it was just bonkers.
So, Nick Butter, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me on. Looking forward to chatting.
I put up your stats on my Instagram story a few weeks ago, all of the things you've done in your life so far, and I didn't name you. I just said I'm really excited to chat to this person on the podcast in a few weeks' time. And within about a minute, I got a reply, and somebody said, that must be David Goggins. It's not David Goggins, but what do you think you have in common with somebody like David Goggins?
Well, I've certainly had an easier life, that's for sure. And I, yeah, David Goggins has always comes up when people talk about crazy challenges like this. Uh, I guess what I do is I put myself through suffering. Um, it's my own decision to, and he's done the same in various forms of life. So I think that's the similarities, but in many ways we're quite different how we approach stuff. Um, his background, the military side, the discipline side. I'm definitely more of just a normal person, and I think David would appreciate that I'm calling him abnormal because he absolutely is. Is a different league, and I don't, I'm not trying to be humble with that. He's truly a different league, and I'm doing stuff because it's the the way that I've learnt to live my life to give me peace, adventure, income, etc. David's, yeah, slightly different league.
You say that you have an easier life than him, but I guess in some ways it's similar in as much as you choose difficulty, or at least to me, looking inwards on your life, it looks like you choose difficulty, right? Some of those stats, almost 850 marathons, 89 ultras, somewhere close to 50,000 miles, running a marathon in every country in the world. These are huge numbers, I'm sure you can appreciate, but where did this all begin?
Yeah, definitely. I suppose if you, yeah, those numbers don't sound particularly easy, but my argument would be that the alternative of that, of not doing those things, is harder. And I think that it takes a certain type of person, and I think there's a good amount of us out there in the world that need that kind of um, drive through challenge. And yeah, those numbers you mentioned have now increased a bit. We're up to 850. That's gone to what, I'm on 1,015 marathons now. Broke the 1,000 mark not so long ago, which was cool. Um, and yeah, we're up to nearly 78,000 miles. So added a few. We just constantly keep going and running and running and running. So where did it all start? It started from, I believe, when I was very young, struggling to walk. So I had, if you see any videos of me when I'm walking, I have my feet completely turned in. Um, I would say 80 degrees in. You're not quite 90, but very, very, very in. And my parents were kind of, I can't remember this because I was too young, but anxious to get me operated on and to fix my legs so I could walk normally. But as it happens over the years, they hesitated with those, and I eventually, my legs straightened up and I was fine, and I was normal. But I think that was something in there about adversity from a young age, and not that I have any recollection of it, but I think something's in there DNA wise. And then from that, growing up in the countryside, and if I wanted to see my mates, if I wanted to go to the shop, I'd have to cycle a long way, I'd have to run a long way. And so fitness and generally being outdoors was a norm, it wasn't just sitting indoors or just driving everywhere, or, it was always that. And then initially it was skiing. Skiing was my love. If you have friends of meet friends of mine from school, I'm a skier really. I was racing very young and joined the under-19 Snow Sports England ski team young, and I loved it. And it was my big goal to be at the Olympics. Definitely hard to be at the Olympics as a skier when you're a Brit, aka no snow. But I got through that period of my life because I had sport at the centre of everything, and I found education, school harder than most. Maybe it's because I'm an August baby, so I'm potentially nearly a year younger than a lot of others. I was dyslexic as well, so I think there was a little bit of struggle, and from that came my love of sport. And ultimately, skip forward several years, I traded in skiing for running, started to compete, started to have some opportunities with some sponsors, and then I went off and did these bigger things. So that's in a nutshell where everything began.
And I want to talk about some of those bigger things in a moment, but I want to pick up on something you just said there, which is interesting. And this is a loose analogy to draw, but it sprang into my mind as you were speaking, right? So I read, maybe it was Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, one of those sleep books a few years back, and there are
Brilliant book.
scientists who are amazing, right? I recommend it constantly on this podcast. But there are scientists who now believe that sleep is, in a sense, our natural state, in as much as because there's so much going on in the body, sleep is the natural state and wake is the kind of inconvenient state where you have to go and get food. You said it's harder to not be doing these challenges, and I've recently started running maybe 4 months ago, and as everybody does, the first couple of months, couch to 5K, absolutely impossible, right? It's a slog, it's awful, it's horrible. But as you do like 10K, 15K, whatever it is, and you continue moving, it almost feels like running, like moving is the natural state, right? The mental clarity, the ability to just keep moving when you don't think you can. Do you think that actually you have it right and most people have it wrong? In as much as, I don't mean that in a judgmental way, but like we all sit here in our offices all day, not moving, completely different to how we've lived for hundreds of thousands of years. Do you think that people are missing out on the fact that actually when you get moving, you realize that that is the natural state?
Well, to put it bluntly, absolutely yes. I fundamentally think that the sleep element is right. We spend a lot of our time sleeping, our ancestors, and if anybody's read, and I'm sure they have read, Christopher McDougall's Born to Run, that touches on the essence of how we would hunt for our food, and how running was such a big part, and being outdoors on our feet, moving for substantial amounts of time. You're talking 8, 10 hours a day, if not more, when most of the time now it's the opposite. We're sitting down, you're getting bad backs, where everything in our body's kind of depreciating as we evolve as a species, because we're behind a desk. We might be evolving in other ways, but certainly physical movement we're not very good at. Over the last, I don't know, maybe in my lifetime, there's been a rise of attention to physical activity, and I think that's great. But running, at the essence of it, is so peaceful to me, and part of that, I believe, is because it's fundamentally innate within all of us. And if you can just go through that initial kind of reversing the few centuries of people sitting behind desks, we can then get back to what's really not so long ago in our history, when we were not behind laptops, not behind desks, not sitting in vehicles, and thinking, horse and carts, we were on horseback, or we were walking, or that kind of thing. So yeah, I absolutely agree, and I am sure that anybody listening to this that have done any running of any form in their life will know that there is a certain blissfulness at some point or another during those runs. And of course there are those tough moments, a lot of tough moments, and I've had a fair share of those, beginning running, and when things get really tough on the longer events. But generally, running is a blissful state of being.
So let's talk about one of those longer events, because the origin story of running a marathon in every country in the world, I think, has two interesting start points. Because, of course, there's the start point where you have the idea, and that's all well and good, right? Like, we all have crazy ideas. Very few people follow through with the ideas. So when did you first think of doing this? Like, where did this seed come from? Talk to me about that. But then perhaps more interestingly, talk to me about the moment when you realized, like, shit, I'm actually doing this. This is going to happen.
Yeah, that was quite scary. So I suppose when I actually thought about doing it is a couple of answers, actually. From a very young age, I made a list on a piece of paper that has lived in an envelope ever since, and it's just all the kind of what ifs what if I could do anything kind of list. I was probably about 15 or 16 when I wrote it, and it was I was with mates, not and my brother, and not really thinking much about it. Things like skydive, swim with dolphins, have a baked bean bath. Silly things, kind of ambitious things, and obviously it would be, oh, wouldn't it be cool to visit every country in the world? And then tagged along to the side of that as, oh, wouldn't it be great to run a marathon in every country in the world because I love running. And and so that you just write it down and you do a few things and it's put away. You don't think about it. But then that came back into my mind when, and the story goes, I was in the Sahara Desert running um, the Marathon des Sables (MDS) many years ago now. And in that desert, one of the competitors was, if anybody doesn't know, that desert race is 7 days in the Sahara, marathon, 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 double marathon, day off, marathon, marathon. So you're doing a lot of running in the sand. 1,000 people take part every year, and one of those competitors that was there with me in my tent was a guy called Kev. He was about 50 at the time, and we were chatting. And most people racing those kind of events are unique in their own way. They're there for a reason. And he was there because, very sadly, he was dying. He had terminal prostate cancer. And he gave me the very profound message over the course of a day or two of, you really have to go out and do what you absolutely love because time is unfathomably short. And I was already living that belief, but he cemented that for me with his words. And it just couldn't escape my mind that I needed to do something more than I was doing, even though by that point I'd already given up my job to be a runner, which is not really a job, let's face it. And I I thought, well, yeah, maybe he's right. Maybe I haven't thought big enough. Maybe there is something I can do. And so, with a little bit of kind of trying to kill two birds with one stone, I thought, right, well, what can I do to live by his counsel, and what can I do to raise some money to help his cancer and trying to raise the awareness that prostate cancer needs talking about more. And that's another message for anyone listening to this: is prostate cancer kills like 12,000 men every year, and it's one of those cancers that the science has been done. And if you just check yourself early. If you're over 40, check yourself early, because it can save your life. And so anyway, I wanted to do something for prostate cancer. Went home a few weeks later. I thought, oh, wouldn't that be cool? Wouldn't it be cool to do a big running thing around the world? Maybe go to every continent, or maybe run through Africa, or and I thought, oh, I wonder what I could do. And then I just thought, well, what about every country? And I was a mad decision of, let's give it a go. Sorry, my dog's scratching herself. Good girl. Wouldn't it be good to do that? And then within a couple of, I'd say 20 minutes to an hour, no more, that idea had kind of taken hold, and it was happening in my mind. And I had no idea what I was doing. I sat my parents down and I said, I'm going to run a marathon in every country in the world. And they said to me, well, how many countries are there? And I said, no idea. No idea how many countries there are, but I'm going to do this. And they know, as well as many of my close friends, and I think lots of people that have read my books now know that if I get to that point where I've made a decision on something, it's happening. And I won't verbalize it until I'm, mentally I've gone through the checklist of very basic things. So anyway, that happened. The second part of your question is, when is it actually happening? And the kind of realization was when I touched down in in Toronto in Canada, January the 6th, 2018, January 7th by the time I landed. And that was my first country of the 196 and of this 2 year mission. It took me 2 years to get to that start line of planning this thing. And then all of a sudden, I landed in Toronto. It was minus 25 degrees C. I was way out of my comfort zone. And I had that memory of, actually, I haven't done any proper running for about 8 months, which was ridiculous to do that. But I got there, and all of a sudden, I knew that we just had to plot out the steps and complete the mission. And 2 years later, we did.
Do you remember the first step? Can you actually go back to the moment where you put your left foot in front of your right, or right in front of left, and you're like, okay, this is it?
Vividly, absolutely vividly. I was with a bunch of people outside. It was the One King West Hotel on Yonge Street in Toronto. It was snowing, bitterly cold. and I had a couple of reporters there and a couple of runners that from the local club that would come out to run with me before they then go off to work, an hour into the run. No idea where I was running. I was just get my watches on and start running. Had both my watches to appease any record guidelines and push start on both of those watches. And it's my right foot first, and we ran towards the lake, and the rest was history, I suppose. Yeah, it was a very surreal feeling of, oh, this is happening, and no idea what's going to be around the corner, but also very aware that all I had to do was put one foot in front of the other. And I don't think I would have got to that point if I hadn't had that cemented in my head. I've done before that point. There was 400 or 500 marathons behind me, so I've done a fair amount of running to that point.
You say that you just had to put one foot in front of the other, and that was my kind of perception of what this challenge was before I really dove into it, right? But between you and the team, like, the logistics are insane, right? I did not appreciate this until I started looking into this project of yours, that even just traveling to 196 countries, let alone doing it on a schedule, let alone doing it with visas and, injuries and movements and this and that. Like, talk to me about that. How big a challenge was it to just even get to the countries, let alone run the marathons in them?
Yeah. And if I'm honest, I think if I knew even just a fraction of the amount, and I'm not exaggerating here, if I knew even maybe 20% of the amount of logistical efforts, finances, the trials that we would have to overcome, just logistically, forgetting about the running, just logistically to make this thing happen, I would not have even started, because it is terrifying. And even just going back and reading a few of the things, because much of the stuff I have to be reminded that had happened because it was such a blur. And it was horrendous. We filled up 9 passports. We thought we would spend about £100,000. We spent about £1 million. We thought we would get on 120 flights. We got on 455 flights. We had 60 odd bribes to pay. We spent tens of thousands of pounds in cancellations of flights, of transport changes. I was bitten by dogs. I was mugged at gunpoint and at knife point. I had a heart attack. I had 22 bouts of food poisoning. All of these things physically are tough, naturally. But actually then logistically, what you have to go through to get from country to country, running 3 marathons in 3 different countries each week, every week for nearly 100 weeks. It was just bonkers. And honestly, starting out on Yonge Street in Toronto, Canada, January the 6th, 18, I had no idea that was all going to be ahead of me. And so I wasn't that scared. All I was worried about was not slipping over on the ice. And it was as simple as that. Ignorance is bliss.
With that in mind, then, this is a weird question, but it's just popped into my head. Imagine the word running wasn't in the dictionary, right? And you had to summarize that challenge, everything you did across those 2 years, as something which encapsulates everything which happened, and we can't use the word running. What was that challenge?
Unrelenting. I think that would be the best word. And I don't want to use the word resilience, because if I'm honest, I wasn't that resilient for a lot of it. I was miserable, I was stressed, I was worried, I was in pain. But it was just have that unrelenting effort versus the unrelenting barriers. And I think it's similar what many people go through over a lifespan of just trials and tribulations. You lose relationships, your finances are good, your finances are bad. You kind of just have to ride that wave. And I really felt like I just had to keep going. So I think unrelenting is the best word. Adventure perhaps, or misadventure, which is probably more apt. Although I believe you can't really have true adventure without lots of misadventure, because that's the definition, I suppose. Yeah, running really was my transport, but that wasn't what summed up the mission.
And so on this theme of having to find that resilience and sometimes not being able to find it, perhaps in the quantities that you would have hoped, I'm sure there would have been moments where you were, either through reality or just through the tricks that your mind was playing on you in those conditions, you were convinced that this is it, it's over, it's not going to happen, we failed, we may as well pack up and go home. When I say those words, does your mind go back to a particular situation?
Yes. It instantly gives me goosebumps and makes me quite emotional, because the first emotion that, when you said that I feel, is anger. And that is because I was on the phone. I was in one of the Pacific Islands. I can't remember where. And I was on the phone to my dad, and we'd had multiple cases up to this point. And we were on, so the whole trip was 674 days. This must have been day 620, 630, something like that. And the phone call came in, and this has been a problem that we've been trying to solve for a long time. And this is in the kind of tail end of the Running the World book. And I I had the call. It's hard to talk about it because it was so. It was just heart wrenching to hear the words from my dad saying, "Look, we can't get you in to Syria. We can't. We don't have the visa for Iran. We don't know how we're going to get you into Yemen." Um, and then several weeks after that, we had another phone call when my driver that was supposed to be taking me into Syria was shot and killed, um, taking somebody else through there, and we had to make another decision. So all of the, and that's just two moments right towards the end. We've had so much that's building up to that point, and I really felt like my luck had run out by that phone call, and that we really can't do this. And I started to think about, right, this was the mission at every country in the world, and I was thinking about the press interviews afterwards of, yeah, I ran a marathon in every country in the world apart from one or apart from two. It doesn't sit well. And I remember hanging up on my dad, and I was really, really angry with myself. And we had to make a decision of what we were doing. And I still had marathons to run in all these other countries and had to just keep going with some blind faith. And with thanks largely, I would say 80% my parents, 20% the rest of the team, especially my brilliant assistant at the time, Veton, they made everything possible. And it was just through constant, unrelenting, once again, effort behind the laptop, behind the computer. Bearing in mind, my parents were in their late 60s at this point, and not particularly computer literate, but they were making it happen from the back end. So I owe them and the rest of the team a great deal. And as you've probably seen in the books and various other podcasts, lots of very interesting serendipitous moments that made things happen. And if you see Olympians stand up on the stage and say, well, how do you think you got here? Aren't you great? And their answer was actually, no, it was a lot of luck. That is exactly how I feel about how we got to the end of Running the World. It was a lot of effort, but we had to have that combination of luck as well. Not to mention the fact that within weeks of finishing, COVID happened. So we were very lucky.
And so, with the combination of luck and effort and determination, how do you go about getting into those countries, Syria, Yemen, Iran, these countries that, I mean, obviously I wouldn't know where to begin, but taking a crew of people there to run around a street which is, in some way compromised, how do you get in?
Well, remember, I was traveling on my own. So I was always on my own, and every country I would be running with lots of people, but they would be from, in-country nationals or tourists and various people. So traveling on my own was another issue because I had to make decisions without having other people to bounce the ideas off. To answer your question about getting into those places, most of the countries we had a fixer or somebody that was on the ground with knowledge, whether it was a hotel receptionist in an easy country, let's say Nice, in France, in Nice, easy peasy, but it's still good to have an understanding of what's going on. Are there protests going on in the area? Are there road closures? Are there air traffic control strikes? Are there, just somebody that will feed us information so we are a little less on the back foot? And so to answer the question directly is we used those fixers, we paid them whatever they needed to be paid to organise transport, to organise safety, to organise routes, to organise visa stamps. And many places in Africa, it was a case of having another person with that person that could translate into different languages going across borders if we had to do an overland transport. I remember once from Gambia into Senegal, we had a driver, but he didn't speak a certain dialect of one of the places we were going through, so he halved his money to give to his friend in order for us to be able to articulate what we were doing with the multiple different non-official checkpoints, logs across roads, things like that through African roads in order to be able to get through. And without the language, we wouldn't stand a chance. So that's just a small example of one of the things we had to think about. And Syria and Yemen, there's too much to say in one one conversation, but there was an awful lot that we had to do. And when we had our driver that was then our fixer, who then got killed, and it was just a case of research, and research. And thankfully, by that point, I wasn't doing this myself, and that's why I'm very keen to make a point that this wasn't my success. This was a success of a lot of people, and I started running even after those 2 years of planning, not knowing how I was going to get into 20, 25 countries, but we started and we made it work by the end. The royal we.
Have you come across Hardest Geezer?
Hardest Geezer, no.
So he is blowing up on the internet right now. He's a YouTuber who does hard stuff, hence the name Hardest Geezer. I think he's from Brighton, ginger guy, probably isn't faring well in the African sun right now, and he's attempting to be the first person to run from the south to the north of Africa. If you could be on the phone with him right now, what advice would you give him, knowing everything you know about running in Africa and crossing land borders there?
Well, I don't think he would probably be able to give me advice. I know a number of people that have run north to south of Africa, because I know he's not the first to do it. There's a bunch of people, some of friends of mine that have done it, and it is tough. And there's a reason why I haven't done it yet, and it's because it's particularly difficult. There's dangers there that are what I would call kind of soft dangers. And as I write in the book, I mean, obviously he's a ginger guy. I'm a white guy running through a predominantly black continent, and you have all eyes on you, and that feels like an incredibly scary, because you don't know whether you're about to run through the wrong place. For example, the Congo, people have been shot just for wandering through the wrong neighborhood. People have been kidnapped for virtually nothing in different places. And largely speaking, and I make a very big point on this in the book, that largely speaking, the whole world is full of fantastic, brilliant, kind, lovely people. And actually, some of the kindest people I've ever met have been through Africa. And yet, there is a certain need and a certain lack of living without certain things that means that Africa is more dangerous. And people are kind of on the edge more. And so there is a sense that stress when you are running, you have to try and bury it, because that stress can cause you to sleep less, can cause everything in your body to work less well, inflammation increases, all this stuff, and you can then cause injuries, and you trip over many problems. So I think, if I could give one piece of advice, because I think he's got the rest covered with land borders and all that sort of stuff, but it's just to really concentrate on accepting that although things feel scary, most of the time they're not. And I have a feeling by now he's experienced that and is completely aware of it. So I don't think that's a problem.
Before we move on to the next challenge, a theme that I guess I picked up on whilst listening to other podcasts, reading bits and pieces here and there about this particular challenge is, and I've probably been guilty of it as well, people come back to the same questions about this, right? Because it's a big shiny challenge, it's the nice round number of all the countries and the running and la la la. What's something you wish somebody would have asked you about this challenge that they haven't yet? What's a story or a lesson from this particular challenge that just you haven't been able to vocalize because nobody's asked?
Because nobody's asked me, yeah. I think I think it's something that I touch on throughout the entire Running the World book, which is the broader sense of perspective and appreciating our place in the world. And there's so few people that have been to every country. Obviously, I'm the only one that's run in every marathon in every country. And I argue that visiting every country is the best education you can ever have. You don't need to be able to add up or write your name to have a fundamental understanding of the world. And yet many people will leave school and higher education with PhDs, but have a very limited understanding of the broader concepts of the world. And so the stuff that I love to talk about with the world was how it gave me this immense inner calm within myself. Once I'd finished, obviously, because it was stressful up to that point. But it was a case of really sitting back. And it's something that my mum's always said to me. And, whenever I would be, we always talk about good and bad mental health, but I think mental health is definitely on a continuum, and everybody experiences that. And when my mum was helping me through my teenage years of ups and downs, she would always say, "It doesn't matter. Look at the bigger picture. It doesn't matter. Things don't matter." And I think that's what I learned through running the world. It was my understanding that I have it good even on the worst possible day, and through that it has made my life happier every day since, because I am stressing less, I am worrying less. If I've not got money to pay for things, it doesn't matter, because ultimately I am in this enormous place of privilege where I have enough people around me, I have enough experience behind me to be able to get through those things. And also, there's another element there of, I've started my charity, the 196 Foundation, after this thing, and it has transformed into this force of good, where we're getting people donating a couple of pound a month, £1.96, obviously that special number 196, into the pot every month, and then we deliver a project anywhere in the world. We've just had a project that I'm about to announce later today, so you're hearing it first, which is project in Kenya, which is building a farm and a school. Um, and, and so I want to talk more about those things. When people talk to me about running the world, it's not just the hardships or how did I get into North Korea or what was my favorite country. It was the bigger picture and how profoundly this trip changed my life, and thus is changing others through the charity.
And so, speaking about things that you didn't really get a chance to speak about, we were chatting just before we started recording about your trip to Italy, and you said something really interesting, which is that it could have been a book in and of itself, but it wasn't. So, if your nice, peaceful trip to Italy was a book, what would that book be about?
Yeah, so yeah, the story goes, I finished running the world. Lots of stuff didn't particularly go to plan. COVID happened. I had all these brilliant ideas, um, lots of expeditions that we're planning and speaking to sponsors. And then all of a sudden, the rug was pulled from us because COVID hit and the world closed down. And then several months, nearly a year later, Italy was open again. And I thought, right, here's my chance. Let's take the van, let's take the dog and my girlfriend at the time. And the mission was run 100 marathons in 100 days, down from the very top with the Austrian border, north of Italy, all the way down to southern Sicily. And that's exactly what we did. But it was another big pivotal kind of philosophical bit of me that, relationship was hard because we were in a foreign country during COVID, not breaking any rules, thankfully, because everything was happening to open up at the right time. But there was so much stuff that went wrong, from navigational stuff to being hit by a car to enormous rows with my then girlfriend, who was incredibly supportive. But it was just mentally brutal because I was used to traveling on my own. I was used to doing these things on my own. And then I was living life in a little box on wheels, which I'm still living out of at the moment, of my van, with a newborn puppy in a foreign country, running through horrendous storms, kind of golf ball size hail. It was just phenomenal. And of course, I got injured during that trip as well, which meant I then had to go and run double marathons towards the end. And yet we got to the finish line, and I finished that trip going, "Gosh, right, I'm putting that to the back of my mind. That was bloody difficult." Because it was emotionally draining. The running was hard, but everything else. And then looking back on it, I, I have literally hundreds of thousands of photos of beautiful parts of Italy that were just emotionally kind of opaqued by suffering. So it was one of those. It was one of those trips that I think I will. Well, I'm writing another book, which is about my journey to 100,000 miles, um, and that will be included in that book in more detail. Um, but it was a tough journey, and it was a very very key stepping stone to running around Britain, because I'd taken 100 marathons in 100 days through Italy, and I wanted to do something similar around Britain, and I didn't want to run north to south of Britain because, frankly, I didn't want to run up the middle of the country. I wanted to be by the water. Water is my peaceful place, and so I decided to to run around it. And then I realized how far it was, and I thought, gosh, I can't spend 200 days doing this because I've got things to do, frankly. I want to do it quicker. And so I thought, well, okay, well, let's try and do a double marathon a day for 100 days. Um, and Run Britain was born, and that again was a big platform to further my career and my love of running. And we're here now with another book.
And I want to talk about that book and that journey in just a moment. But something that popped into my mind as you're speaking about some of the challenges from Italy, and I reflect on some of the challenges from the world, is I struggle to know how to word this. What do you feel in the moment like you get out of these huge challenges? Because to somebody who listens to you speak, right, you've listed off endless challenges, endless difficulties, endless, relationship problems, injuries, food poisoning, illness, stress, all of these things, right, that most people would look at and just be like, I'm all right, I'll just pop to Weatherspoons on Saturday and that's me, I'm fine. You must be getting something huge and profound from it. How would you articulate what it is that you get?
Yeah, and I think that's an incredibly good question, and it's a question that truthfully I can't answer in its entirety. I think there will always be a part of me that can't answer that fully. And when people say, "Oh, why do you do what you do?" and my answer is because I love it, because I have this incredible privilege that so many people in the world don't have the opportunity to. There's so many people that haven't even left their own country. There's 1% of the world that have run a marathon, tiny percentage of the world. And I've done all of these marathons, visited all these incredible places. But to answer that question of what I get out of it in the moment, I think it is, truthfully, I think it's a bit of escapism. I think it's bury myself. And I think David Goggins and I are similar in this way, and a lot of other people that do this kind of stuff, is you bury yourself in that moment and everything else just kind of fades to black. There isn't anything there that you're thinking about, worrying about. It's a very selfish place, but it's a very beautiful place as well. You are just in that moment, suffering through whatever hardship you're in. And also, let's face it, life is lived through moments of hardship. If you just had the good points in life, you would be existing but not particularly living and thriving. And it's just the same if somebody wins the lottery and they have unlimited money, they still end up putting themselves in positions where they have to experience adrenaline. They have to suffer. They have to get themselves out of it. And it comes back to our earlier conversation about kind of our innate human being essence, which is that we've had to struggle for a long time to feed ourselves, to live. And I think there's so much of that DNA in us still, because really it's not that long ago that we were living like that. And maybe that's been bolstered a little bit more through world wars and all sorts of stuff. But I think it's in our DNA. I think that is why we do it, and that is why when I can firmly say doing these things is where I need to be, because it just feels right, no matter how hard. Yeah, suffering and going through hardships is I think what makes us human.
I think that actually links back even more closely to that original point that we spoke about, because without getting too philosophical here, I wonder whether because so many people, myself included, aren't doing the things that you're doing, right, even on a smaller scale, we're not pushing ourselves enough. It's not like we live without this suffering. It's not like we live without this look for escapism. We just look to entirely synthetic things, right? Like we all have escapism and we all have things that we deal with, but we deal with them in very artificial, very non-traditional, for want of a better word, ways. Again, do you have it right? Is it just stick your shoes on, go outside, move, deal with what's in your mind, listen to yourself? Is that a cheat code to life in some ways?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of categories that you can put that in. So kind of people that live indoors versus outdoors. I think that's quite big there. You can have a conventional job. Let's say you are, I don't know, an IT analyst or something. You work in IT. You're indoors looking at a screen. A builder. You are most of the time outdoors. It's still a hard job. You are still putting similar effort in slightly different ways. Maybe you're straining your eyes if you're inside looking at a screen, and as a builder, you're maybe straining your muscles and you're physically more active. But the life lived outdoors from my experience of my time on the planet, people are happier in themselves when they are outdoors. And I think it comes right back to that fundamental, innate stuff with human beings. And then, so that's one little category. The other category is then running, sport, and having that adrenaline and being able to hunt for food, eating food, repeating. The fact that we can just pop down to the supermarket and shops and buy food and shovel it in, and is obviously causing the whole planet, especially certain parts of the world. Let's name America for one, which is kind of undoing this essence because everything's too easy. So, yeah, to answer your question, absolutely, it's where we all should be living more, and it's why I'm trying to encourage as many people as possible, not just to run, but just to focus on what they love to do. And I think they will then eventually come back to something being outdoors and something being rather wholesome and peaceful. I've never been more happy than living out of a van with very few things, living by the ocean, running a lot. Um, that says enough for me.
And that's exactly what you did next, right? You took the van, or a different van in this case. You went to the ocean and you got outdoors. Talk to me about this Run Britain challenge again. Where did this come from? What's it all about?
Yeah. So circling back to Italy, we finished Italy. Um, were miserable as sin at the end of it because it was so stressful. And as Italy was eventually closing its borders again because of the second bout of COVID, we made a run for it, quite literally, to whiz the van, turn the van around from Sicily and drive as far north as we could to go and spend a few months, what ended up being 3 or 4 months in the French Alps, in an entirely locked down ski resort, which was utter bliss, to be honest. But in that time, I was plotting all these things that I'd wanted to do post running the world and couldn't because COVID hit. And I thought, right, well, what can I finally do now? And we were planning X, Y, and Z, and we still couldn't get there because of COVID. And eventually, the news came that the British government was opening up again, and the country was free, and we could run for more than an hour a day, and we could run with other people. And I thought, right, 17th of April is that date. I think it was the 15th of April, sorry, is that date when everything unlocked. And 3 or 4 weeks before then, I thought, wouldn't it be good then to run around Britain? And as I just mentioned, I didn't want to run north to south because it was either too short and I've done it before. I wanted to run around and I wanted to be near the ocean. And as I said, and I've just read something a few weeks ago, in fact, about how just being near bodies of water can bring you peace. And I always loved being by the ocean. And so I thought, right, let's run around the country. And there was an essence of me as well. I wanted to kind of unite the runners in Britain because we'd all been just stuck, and there's kind of been this running revolution where people could only run or exercise for an hour a day. So there was more people out there that could do it. And I thought, yeah, this is a good opportunity to bring people together. And also, I wanted to see the country because I felt rather silly that I'd been to every country, but I hadn't run around my own country yet. So let's go and tick that box. Now, Britain is actually bloody massive when you run around it. So doing 2 marathons a day, 5,500 miles around the island, it's going to take some time. I set my target of 100 days. 4 weeks later, after dreaming that up, we'd come back from France and we were ready to drive a couple of vans down to St Austell, the Eden Project, and we were going to run anti-clockwise around the country. I had trained virtually nothing. I mean, I'd done some running in the mountains. I'd done plenty of ski touring. It was generally very foolish, let's put it that way, and that's definitely documented in the Run Britain book. But I eventually got to the start line. Very good teammates, some people there that were going to help me. We had 2 vans, and it was a case of, with photographers, with some various different help, I would travel and run about 12 hours a day, 2 marathons a day for 100 days. It didn't quite work out like that. There was lots of things that went wrong, but just like with all the other bits, we suffered through and eventually crossed the line 28 days later than planned, but we finished it. We beat the existing record by several hundred days. It was a slower record, and I was thin. I was basically a skeleton. There's a photo in the book of me looking incredibly thin. I was down to just under 3% body fat, and we made it. But those 128 days was very, again, just like with all the other missions, very enriching, because it brought me closer to a very good friend of mine, who was my right hand man on the mission, Andy, who also co-authored the book. His diary entries are in the book, so people can hear about what it's like from the other side. And it wasn't just a case of some polite inclusion here of me asking Andy to write a few words. All right, Pops, scratching again. Andy needed to have a voice in the book because people don't understand how much pressure the team are under when somebody does something like this. So he has a very good, and it's funny as well. Some of his bits in the book are hilarious because he was seeing me at my worst, and he was less tired than me, so could remember them.
Something interesting about Andy's entries in the book is it gives this second perspective of, I don't want to say sanity, because that would be suggesting that what you were doing is insane. However, there's this kind of eternal optimism in your narration of what you've been doing, right? Although you talk about the hiccups, yes. Whereas Andy, almost from day one, is like, this is crazy, this has gone wrong, he hasn't considered this. And it's so interesting to hear almost, I don't want to say the voice of the reader because he's not the reader, right? But he's almost thinking in real time what we're thinking. And it's a really interesting addition.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of moments there, and I know Andy is such a good friend. And honestly, I feel so honoured to have spent that time with him. And as I write in the book, very few people, other than your partner or your family, do you spend 4 months living in a box, side by side, him literally feeding me every single meal, washing my clothes, washing my underwear in his bare hands in the sink, like cleaning out our little box. Like, he was absolute rock to me, and he made everything possible. And we bonded. But he was living a different mission than I was, because I had to have that eternal optimism, and he had to be, even though if it was unspoken most of the time, this voice of reason and a voice of pragmatism to make sure things were moving forward. And where I would say, "Oh yeah, I'll run up here and I'll see you in 10 miles and I'll find the route," he would say yes to me, and yet he would then hop ahead and make sure that I was on the right route. That's just a tiny example of all of the many things, but he was just as much of this journey as I was. He wasn't running much of it. He still did a lot of running with me, but he was driving a very rickety small van around tiny little lanes on the coast of Britain.
Something that comes across in the early pages of the book is that, it ended up being a 128-day mission. It could have been an 8-day mission and still have been just as ridiculous and difficult, right? Those first few days genuinely sound just unbearable in so many ways. As I'm driving down the road in my nice heated seated car listening to it, I'm like, Jesus. But you say in those early pages that you get through those moments because you've managed to build this kind of mental fortress in your mind, right, that helps you overcome the physical and the mental difficulties. Talk to me about that. What is it? How do you get there? How do you build one of your own if you're listening to this and interested?
Yeah. So again, I want to try and be completely transparent and as truthful as possible here, is that, me referring to this as my mental fortress, it sounds very neat and tidy and locked away, that I've got this perfect system. There is no perfect system. Nobody that does any of this stuff, including David Goggins, has a perfect system. But we just have methods and a format to follow, and we try and stick to it as much as possible. My mental fortress was a case of building a few parameters that were in place. For example, in Run Britain, I would always start 6 o'clock on the dot in the morning. And as the reader goes through, I won't spoil it, but as the reader goes through the book, you can see how my mentality towards that hard start changes. But having that basic format and some real key bits in my life, because all I was doing was running for 12 hours a day. I was eating as much as I possibly could, trying not to, frankly, shit myself too much, because that happened, as you can read in the book, rather a lot. And I was going to bed, sleeping as much as I could, as quickly as I could, and repeating for 4 months with very little anything else. And so this mental fortress was about putting key markers, key flags in my day, in my life, that I could cling to. The start points, the finish points, the midpoint, my feeding times. There was no set way I would look at this fortress. I wouldn't go, right, I need to get into this mental state. It was just a case of constant being to protect myself from pain, from doubt, specifically doubt, because you have a lot of doubt when you get injured on day 6, when you've got months to keep running for. And what you referred to then about the beginning bit of the book, there's a big chapter in the book, the beginning chapter of just the first week. And it's because so much was going wrong. And when you do something like this, it's always going to be the beginning days that are hard. And that's when you need to fall back on your mental fortress. So I think if anyone's listening to this and they want to try and harbor something similar, my only advice that's any decent, any good really, is to at least create a format of which you can deal with things in. So for example, if people want to, I don't know, go to the gym every morning or go for a run every morning, just give yourself a little bit of a framework to make it possible. Help yourself out. Put your clothes out the night before. Set a few alarms. Make sure that you sleep with the window open so you wake up with the sun, the blind open, for example. Like little things that you can put in place. And so that's all I was doing to help the lack of doubt, to help the lack of pain. Just try and give you some framework to work with. Yeah.
It's interesting to hear you speak about that in reality, right? Because there are, for example, David Goggins, you say that you don't have the same military background as him, but one of the things that he takes and everyone takes from military training, it seems, in these books that we read, is that focus on discipline and consistency and things just being the same every day to allow you to then think bigger, right? We look at books like The Slight Edge, Atomic Habits, they all tell you to do these things. And it's very easy for someone like me, right? Where it's like, oh, on my spreadsheet of things to do today, I'm going to wake up at 7:30, I'm going to not have caffeine after 2 p.m. But to hear it out on the road, literally working, keeping you going mile after mile is so interesting, because it is just that unshakable testimonial that this stuff works.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And that's very eloquent of you, because it does work. And as soon as you, so for example, I've had a few friends and people that I coach and random people that have messaged me on social media or whatever, they say, oh, I want to get into running. What do I do? And my advice is always the same. If you want to get into running, actually want to get into running. So first of all, you have to kind of actually ask yourself a question of, do you really want to get into running? Because a lot of people want to for the wrong reasons. For example, their mates are, or because they think they should. If you truly want to get into running, then you will, which is a big part of it. But once you're there, my advice to them is run every day for 30 days. And people go, whoa, that's mental. But I'm not asking people to run hundreds of miles every day. I'm asking people to run a couple of 100 meters, a kilometer. Just get your gear on and get into the habit, and that habit forming and that discipline of having a horrible day at work. You get back, maybe you've got a party to go to, maybe you've got to go to the vet or something, and it gets to 10 p.m. and you go, I haven't done my run today. Get your shoes on, go out, run around the block, come back, take them off, have a shower. You've done your run. So it's a case of just, and that's a lot of stuff that I do now, even when I have to get back into some training, is just to go, right, every single day at the same time, I'm going to get out and I'm going to run. Doesn't matter how far, doesn't matter how fast, just get into the habit. And a good example of that, a very good friend of mine, he said, you asked me the same question, I gave him the same advice, and he took that advice and he stuck to it. And he's now on day, I don't know, 220 something. He's just been running every single day. He's entering races where he never ran races before. He's got all the kit. He's completely immersed in the running world. And it all started from discipline, from getting up day 2, day 3, day 4. And it's the same if you're not a runner as well. It's the same with work. It's the same with my to-do list that I have today. I will make myself some firm things that I will do before I sleep, and there'll be a list of things that I might get to. But it's just being really clear with yourself and setting those goals. So, and I'm very grateful. I don't know where I get that from in terms of discipline, but I'm very grateful for it, because it has enabled me to achieve certain things that I think otherwise would have maybe taken me longer, or I would have just given up.
Do you struggle in some ways then with days like today more than days where you have to do 2 marathons back to back? Because, you've got this annoying guy who wants to do this podcast, and then the PR guy might email you and say, how did it go? And you're not in a lay-by right now, and there's this and that. Like, does this kind of comfort, but the trade-off of comfort being a lack of consistency, does this hurt in a way?
Spot on. I don't think it would. I don't say it would hurt, but it is harder. Getting up and bizarrely getting up at 5:50 and running at 6 o'clock every day for 4 months, double marathons, was in many ways mentally entirely easier than this life I am now, where I'm not doing it, because there wasn't any question. Because if I didn't get up at that point, the mission would fail. It was very easy at the moment. If I don't do some things on my to-do list, then somebody can very easily look at it and go, "Oh well, I'll do it tomorrow." But I've tried desperately to keep that same mindset of, if I don't do these things, then the goal, which is at the end, which may be 3 or 4 months from now, won't be hit. And I think CEOs, people in business that succeed, have that same mindset of just having one eye on the impact of not doing these things. And so I really try and be consistent. But equally, I think a message to everybody is to constantly have a foot off the gas moment. So intend to not put pressure on yourself for, I don't know, 2 days a week, aka a weekend. When you work for yourself, you don't really have a weekend. But or just in life, go right. Well, and for me, it's always the month of August. For the month of August, I have my downtime. Month of August, I work less. I look at my laptop less. I check my emails less. I do less interviews, and I might even run more. But it's having that kind of discipline and being okay to have the flexibility, but still live within the framework that you're setting yourself. And the hardest part, just like trying to get into anything, is finding what framework works, being as flexible as you need to be without kind of falling off the wagon. And one final thing I'll say on that, with running, with the people that I coach, we have a very strict formula, which is we have a week to focus on endurance, we have a week to focus on speed and tempo work, and then we have a week to focus on recovery. And that recovery week is a week. Every third week is a week off, effectively. You are recovering, you're still running a bit, you're still doing some yoga or some stretching or mobility work, but you're not in this cycle. So you have an opportunity to get out. So you don't have this horrible vision of this is never ending. You have a break, and that is quite important in training, I think, and life.
So as we come towards a close, I want to zoom out again and kind of pull out some of the lessons that this whole thing so far has taught you. And where I want to begin is an interesting place, I think, because by definition, every marathon is the same length, right? And so this length of marathon always becomes this vessel of stories and emotions and feelings and doubts and euphoria and all the good things as well. So with that in mind, what has felt like your shortest marathon, i.e. your easiest perhaps, and what has felt like your longest marathon?
Gosh, and I'm not exaggerating here, shortest marathons, I would say I've had 100, marathons where they have truly felt like a 5K and maybe an 8K. Let's, try and be as realistic as I can. And I'm not exaggerating there. When you get into a happy rhythm, generally it is two-thirds of the way through a particular type of mission. So like running Italy, running the world, run Britain, once you get to a certain point, they become second nature. You feel great. You don't really think about them, and before you know, there's many times where I've got to the marathon distance and not noticed because I've just been happy. I've been in the zone. Everything's fine. So they're the ones that feel short. The one that comes to mind actually is Nice, during running the world, and I have no idea how long it took me at all, but it felt like I just went out for a quick jog and got it done and came home, and that was because I was in that easy rhythm. So yeah, and don't think I can answer. I don't think I can pick one specifically. That's as close as I can get for that one. The longest one, naturally, they're the hardest ones. They're the ones that suffer the most. Breaking my ankle in the Sahara, that was a brutally long mentally and literally, horrible run. Running with food poisoning and throwing up 25 times, 26 times across a 26-mile run in Bangladesh, in crazy hot, humid, and that was tough. Um, the longest one, other than that, I think is during Run Britain, when I was on day 6, when double marathon in and a 19-hour day, broken bones, flip meniscus, just in pain, and it was longest in time and the longest in my mind. It felt like weeks. And in contrast, I was running with Sean Conway the other day, who's approaching his 102 Ironman in 102 days, which is just unbelievable. And I've got huge respect and admiration for him. I ran with him, and I was very aware when I was running with him. He was, what, day 78 I ran with him. He was 78 days into this mission, and a marathon after doing all of these swimming and cycling and 2.4 mile swim, 112-mile bike, then a marathon. And I rocked up fresh as a daisy, only doing one, and chatting away with him. It felt like I was running with him for about 25 minutes. And yet it was several hours, 4 or 5 hours that we were running together. And it must have felt incredibly long for him, but not for me. And that's all perceived in the mind. And it's just a big reminder to me. And it was a real kind of wake up moment when I was running with Sean, that all of these things I've gone through is all perceived in here. Your body is still doing the same thing, and you can make whatever you make of it.
And so let's talk about that perception, right? Let's rewind 1,015 marathons. You're at the start line of whatever your first marathon was, and you're a different person then, in some ways at least, compared to who you are today, right? What is the most important lesson you've learned about yourself in all of that time and in all of those miles?
There's a lot I've learned about myself. From one angle, me being an athlete, a runner, an adventurer, whatever you want to call it, has taught me that I innately am quite selfish, which is often perceived as a bad thing. And in many walks of life, it is. But in certain walks of life and in internal success, it is quite important to have that balance. And so I would argue that understanding the balance of being selfish or selfless is an art. And I think it takes quite a long time as an adult to form that right, the right balance of that. Because I want to be selfless in my life, in my relationships, but I need to be selfish in my career, and I need to be disciplined with what I do, because otherwise I'll not be true to myself, but I also won't achieve what I want to achieve. So I think some people out there are maybe too nice, too selfless, maybe don't put themselves first. And they also don't understand that in order to achieve certain things, it's okay to be selfish as long as you're not harming other people. So that is a big lesson that maybe you weren't expecting me to say, but it is something that's been very profound in my running stuff, and has taught me since I started running. Other than that, it comes back to the bigger picture of my place in the world. And I've learned, as I'm sure many parents say to many kids, you don't know how lucky you are. We are so lucky. You're so privileged. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I used to always get that as a kid. And the realization is that I was so much more lucky than I could ever realize. And I'm so much more lucky now than I truly realize, because the basics are being covered when so many people out in the world aren't having their basics met. And, you're talking food, water, shelter, but I've also got opportunities. And I have opportunities because of the position I'm in, when so many people don't. Of all those people that haven't been to another country, it's not because they don't want to, it's because they don't have the opportunity to. And so I think one is the selfish, selfless thing. One is my perspective on the whole world. And the final thing is about the gratitude I have for the opportunities that I've been given and have been, making for myself through those practices, like the mental fortress and the form, having a format for life. So it's not perfect, but running has certainly made me
And you kind of touched on your answer there, the contrast that you have been afforded through running and visiting every country in the world, through running every inch of the edge of this island of ours, right? What have you learned about other people in doing that?
Yeah, it's incredibly profound, the amount of people that are so wonderful, and how everybody is experiencing. So everybody's different. We understand every human being is different. We never have nobody's exactly the same, and yet we are all forever and will always be experiencing the same range of emotions. Everything is on a sliding scale. Whether you're hungry, whether you are happy, whether you are angry, all of these things are on a sliding scale all the time, and we're always moving them left to right depending on what we're doing. But as human beings, those different parameters, they don't change for different people. We just experience them in different ways. And I've learned that most people are happier and kinder and more selfless than we perceive. And I think that's largely down to media, because we only see stuff that's going wrong, and maybe the celebrating successes bit isn't done enough. And I think we're in a little bit of a, maybe microcosm is not the right word, but we are in a vacuum of miserable media, as I call it, where we are just being fed the rubbish stuff. And actually, if we had another, or let's say we had two TVs on the wall, and let's say we turned the TV on with only the good stuff happening, we would all realize quite how wonderful the world is, and we would stop looking at the bad stuff. So for that reason, I don't have my news alerts on anymore. I have alerts that give me updates on who's been winning in certain sports things. I don't have much interest in the other stuff, and I'm not saying I ignore it because of the charity. We're doing loads of other stuff, but there's so much good that's being done. There's a brilliant book called, you've probably read it, Factfulness by Hans Rosling, which is all about you should read it if you haven't. It's a stunning book. It's about just how well we have progressed as a species, and how brilliant we have this world. It's acknowledging everything that we need to do. For example, there's 2 million children in the world that die of starvation every year, which is just outrageous. But if you look at the numbers of what it was before and how much young girls are in school, we're just living in the best time we've ever had, and yet there is still so much more to do. So I think that's answered your question.
It did. And I want to end here, right? So you just said that we all have the same range of emotions. Like deep down somewhere, we're all kind of the same, right? We all want the same things. We all run, no pun intended, from the same things and so on. And yet somebody may have been listening to us chat for the last hour and they say, this Nick guy, he's inspiring, but I'm not the same as him. I can't do the things he's done. I can't go to the places he's gone to, right? I just don't have it in me. But you've evidently learned a lot about yourself, right? About the challenges, the ups and downs. And from that, you've taken a bunch of lessons. So if we can at least for just a moment plant the belief into whoever's listening that actually fundamentally they are the same as you, because we're all the same, what lessons from everything you have done would you leave them with just before we finish?
Yeah. I'll actually just copy back from what you've just said there. I did a talk a couple of years ago, and I took some questions at the end, and a lady put her hand up and said, what advice would you give us normal folk? We know that you're you. And I said, whoa. I'm exactly the same as you. I'm living. I'm just another human being. I'm just maybe approaching things slightly differently. And I had this question about kind of what would I employ other people to do? Is give yourself some slack. We're all very stressed generally for things that don't matter. It's coming back to that message that my mum's always given me, is things don't really matter, and the world's certainly taught me that we can take our foot off. And then contrasting to that, it's about valuing our time. And I talk about this in Run Britain quite heavily. If we can combine valuing our time with living in a kind world and doing kind things, as that famous way to live, which is the 3 golden rules, which is be kind, and be kind. If you can be kind, and if you can appreciate the value of your time, then we're going to be living in a happier world. So I'm speaking to you because I value what you do. I appreciate how this will benefit us mutually and other people. And I've taken a snapshot, immediate general response to the value that we're both going to be getting here. And so it links back with this selfish element. If people can step back and go, I need to value myself, I need to be kind in the world and appreciate the short amount of time that I have, it will suddenly give a little bit of a rocket up the backside of people to say, look, we only live for, on average in Britain, around 81 years old is the average age, average life expectancy. It's very easy to get quite close to that without fulfilling your dreams because you feel like you've got unlimited time, and you don't. Yet you don't need to rush at it. You just need to get there hastily, if that makes sense. So you can, there's poetry, there's writings about this, but it's really profound to me that we have such a short point on the time on this planet, and yet we still have time each day to do what we love, to be kind, and to value what we're giving to other people. So it's a bit of a messy answer because it's not, life is not straightforward, but valuing our time and being kind to others, and maybe taking your foot off your own neck sometimes when things start to get a bit stressful, is a good way to be.
Amazing. Nick, I've enjoyed this so much. I'm so glad that this was both about running, but also in no way about running, right? This was about life. I'm going to make sure that
Yeah.
both your books are linked in the show notes below for people to go and grab them and read them. And I recommend they do. They're crazy in every way. I don't actually normally hype books myself when I finish a conversation, but it's just the craziest thing. So I do recommend everybody reads them because they're not about running, right? If people want to go elsewhere to find your stuff, where can they go?
Yeah, thank you. And just a message to say thank you to you, Sean. I think, it's great to have the opportunity and the platform to speak about these things. So don't underestimate the power of what you do. So I'm very grateful for that. And for everybody listening, because if nobody's listening, then we wouldn't be having the chat. So thank you for listening as well. Where can people go? My website or my Instagram. So if you just search my name, Nick Butter, or Nick Butter Run, which is a lot of my social media handles, you'll see what I do. I'm also just about to launch Run Weekends, which is running retreats all over the world that I'm leading. So very running the world style, taking people to far-flung places and doing a few runs and having a good time. And also, very importantly, my foundation, if anybody can afford £1.96 a month, less than £24 a year, we put all that money into a pot and all the donors then vote on which project we help anywhere in the world. And to be clear on that, it doesn't have to be any particular thing that we're doing. We get people come to us. Last year, we developed a machine in Nepal that was delivering affordable sanitary products to girls in schools. This year, we're building a farm and a school in Kenya. There's loads of other stuff that we're doing, and again, if you want to be involved with my future expeditions, if you want to come and run with me, then just drop me an email. All my information is on the website, nickbutter.com.